what I'm going to do today is walk you through some research that myself and my colleagues have been involved in for a number of years now in Parkinson's disease. And a lot of this research stemmed from the idea that the brain has this capacity to repair itself to some degree, and how can we study that in the context of Parkinson's disease? So I'm going to walk you through some terms that are going to be very important to think about as we talk about what exercise may be doing, not only in terms of behavior, but also the underpinnings of it. What are the changes that drive these behavioral effects? This work, by the way, has been supported by a number of different groups. I think the first I should say is I have a number of families that have been very much important in our support, including Robert Gonzalez family. They were the founders of Mission Tortilla. So they're from Mexico. They actually supported a lot of this work, as did the US Army, the DoD, and the Parkinson's Foundation. All right. So just to remind you, you've seen this slide many times. We think about Parkinson's disease, and when you hear about it, we think about it as cell loss. And what I'm showing you is a part of the brain to the left with colorized. These cells are colored because they carry melanin in them. It's one of the few areas in the brain that you actually can see the cells. Many cells don't have any color, but in this case, you can see them because they have melanin, which is black. And so you're seeing at the top what would be a normal number of cells, and with Parkinson's disease that there's less cells. That's why we consider Parkinson's what we call a neurodegenerative disorder, meaning loss of cells. And then the whole idea of why cells are dying, we don't know. I think the other thing, just to keep in mind, there is cells that are still remaining, of course, in Parkinson's, so you don't lose all your cells. But also one thing you have to keep in mind is that these cells and what they make, called dopamine, are projecting into a bigger system. So, it's just like you would imagine, nothing is in isolation in the brain. Things are working with other areas of the brain. And so what drives behavior isn't a single cell. It's actually how it's interacting with other cells. And then, so we call that a circuit. Circuit just means that different parts of the brain connecting up. And where does dopamine work in that system? The best analogy that I can give you is a car, an engine of a car, and kind of the fuel to that engine. So if you think about a car with a gas tank and an engine, and for all you engineers out there, of course, you understand that engine is what really drives the car, right? The gas tank is important, you need the fuel, but it's really that engine that's really making the car go. So think about dopamine and loss of dopamine as being the gas tank, okay? What I study is the engine and what's happening at the engine level. And so I'm going to show you a slightly different drawing that you might not typically see in a Parkinson's talk, but this is a drawing now of circuits. And we actually had this drawing made for a paper of ours, but basically what I'm showing you, there's an outline in blue of a brain. And in yellow, we've colorized, we actually just made circles of different parts of the brain that are connecting up, obviously a simplified version, but I'm just showing you two yellow circuits of approximately where different areas of the brain are connecting up that drive motor behavior. In other words, my ability to move through space. And so what you see is the gas tank down below the dopamine is the gas being delivered to the front engine. And you see the engine as an example in these two yellow circles, which are just examples to show approximately where these different areas of the brain are linking up to drive movement. And I think one other thing to keep in mind is there are obviously many of these circuits. There's not one circuit. There's some pretty important circuits, but there's actually a couple circuits that involve my ability to move safely through space. And what's also important here to remember is that some of these circuits also involve the surface of the brain. We call that the cortex. So you're going to see to the left, the prefrontal cortex is a name of one cortical area. And it has a very specific name because it's also what we call the CEO of the brain. It makes me think and process information. So that's now the third point. So the first point was Parkinson's disease is indeed a neurodegenerative disease, but the second point is it doesn't explain all of behaviors. Circuits do, and I'm showing you examples of circuits in yellow. And then the third point is some of these circuits connect up with thinking parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex. So some of my movement in space is actually a thoughtful process. I plan and process this information as I move through space, and some of it is more automatic. The circle that I'm showing you coming from the motor somatosensory, you see this circuit, if you can see my little cursor, it comes down to the basal ganglia. That's what we call automatic movements. So automatic movements happen because I practice them like since I was a baby. I've been practicing how I walk. I've been practicing my ability to ride a bike. They get so good that they become automatic. I don't need to think about them anymore. Thank goodness, right? Because that would be no fun, right? If I have to keep thinking about what I do day to day, correct? But remember, I also have this other system, as I said, the thinking part of movement. So the bottom line is I use both. I use the automatic circuit, things that I've practiced my whole life, and I use my thinking circuit to move through space. Those are kind of important ideas as we start talking about where exercise may be benefiting different areas of the brain. These are circuits that are going to be important for us to think about as we go forward. And just so you know, when we think about dopamine in the gas tank, you notice that the gas tank of dopamine hits a couple of these circuits. It obviously hits the thinking part of the circuit, but it also hits the automatic part of the circuit. But, you know, in terms of where dopamine is lost, it's not distributed evenly. Actually, what gets more affected or impacted is the automatic part. So the top part of the circuit, this part of the circuit gets disrupted more. So what Parkinson's disease is, if you, I'm not sure if you've heard this term, but it's good to know, it's more loss of automaticity. So things automatic are not as easy, and that manifests as slowness. Slowness is really that. Slowness is what happens when things are not as automatic, okay? So I'm just kind of laying down groundwork of what Parkinson's is when we think about movement and how my movement is affected, and when we think about the brain. Circuits are important, and different circuits are slightly different in terms of how they're contributing to my ability to move. Okay, so now we're going to go to another idea, and what I'm doing is I'm preparing you for this discussion we're about to have. There's some basic information you kind of need to know for you to understand what I start talking about, right? So that was fine. That's Parkinson's disease. Now let's get to this idea of what neuroplasticity is. So what I'm about to tell you is something that you've probably heard already. Your brain changes on a regular basis, and it changes in ways that influence those circuits. So remember, circuits are connections, right? So I didn't show connections, I just showed circuits, but in there are cells connecting up. Fundamentally, when we talk about changes in the brain, it's really happening a lot at the level of those connections. In fact, those connections have a name. They're called synapses. So fundamentally, neuroplasticity is changes or restructuring of those synapses. And when I mean change, they can change in their size, their amount, they can change even in what they're delivering. So they have kind of this functional part of change and this structural part of change that drives normal behavior, but also can, in various situations like injury, can certainly adapt, it can alter. But what's kind of cool is the idea that I myself, in what I do day to day, I influence those connections, don't I? Let's go back to the idea of automatic movements. How did I get there? How did I get to that circuit that was automatic? I get there because I've been practicing, you see. I've been doing things so much that that circuit starts getting really robust. Everybody here, I'm sure, has gone through some years of education, and the idea is that in that period of learning, whether it's a language or mathematics or whatever the skill might be, law, I've read and considered and thought this enough that these connections start getting laid down. So that is fundamentally what plasticity really means. It means that I'm laying down circuitry. What happened, though, was that no one really put these ideas together with Parkinson's disease, if that makes sense, okay? So the idea is, if I have a circuit now that is having problems, like I said in Parkinson's disease, could I retrain it? Could I do anything that would make it healthier? So that's sort of the idea of where rehab, just like I do when I read a book, I'm learning something, right? So the question is, okay, can I rehabilitate not only my behavior, but am I rehabilitating, am I re-engaging a circuit to drive repair? That's a very important idea because not only does that suggest I might be able to improve it, but more importantly, it gives me a tool to understand how that happens, right? A mechanism that becomes quite valuable, right? I now understand something about how this modeling happens, and maybe I can find something to enhance it at some point. So these are sorts of things that I'm thinking about as I'm going to talk to you about Parkinson's disease. And notice one other really important point. I didn't talk about those dopamine cells at all, have I? No, I haven't talked about returning dopamine cells. Everything I'm talking about right now is where in the car? It's not in the gas tank, guys. It's in the engine. Now, remember, of course, dopamine is being delivered to that engine. So I'm going to be looking at circuits itself, and I'm going to be looking a little bit of how dopamine is being delivered to that engine. But I'm not looking at the gas tank. I'm not looking at cells. I'm looking downstream. And you know, everyone has their own idea of what they think is important. We chose to look at the engine because we felt if you were going to look anywhere for change, you'd want it to be there at the level of the engine. Does that make sense? So I'm not looking for cells now. I'm looking at how efficient those circuits going to be. Okay? All right, moving on. So let's go back again. Fundamental ideas. Does experience in the form of movement, does it change our brain? Well, I told you, yeah. I mean, how do you think you got to learn to ride a bike, guys, right? How do you think you got to learn to move? All right, this is not, you know, these are things we know, right? We know what kids do to get better. We know what athletes do. So the point is, which I find very interesting and curious, it's like, duh, right? You get this sort of like, no kidding, Sherlock. I mean, right? I mean, it's obvious. Of course it's going to help, isn't it? It's sort of intuitive. Why does the brain suddenly decide, well, I've got Parkinson's. I can't do anything now. All right. I always tell this to the residents, and I always say this sort of basic point. No one has a Martian brain. Okay. No one's allowed to have a Martian brain. What do I mean by that? We all have the same type of brain. We all have the brain with the same sort of mechanisms. You don't have a special brain that decides to do its own little thing because, well, you have a Martian brain. We all have the same type of brain, so the rules are going to apply always and forever. Now, they can change as we get older, but they're not going to suddenly disappear. And so, again, we accepted, of course, as children, we accepted why would it not still happen into adulthood and even in the context of injury. So I've kind of walked you through, again, the big picture of why this became so important. And also I'm going to tell you, so myself and my husband, Mike Jackwick, when we first got involved in this whole study, I have to tell you, people didn't even believe us that this was possible. As crazy as that sounds now, the original work we did was really poo-pooed that this was not possible because Parkinson's disease was a cell loss problem. How would that relate to Parkinson's? So the steps that I just went through with you, we had to go through with our colleagues to try to convince them that this mattered, because when we entered the field, no one was studying exercise in the context of people with Parkinson's disease. Now that I have Parkinson's disease, what happens? The work that had been done up to that point had been, if I exercise, do I prevent it? But what we brought to the field was, okay, now that I have it, does it matter? So let's walk through that right now. I'm just going to show you the first ideas that came on the field when we started talking about exercise and change for behavior. So now we're looking at, do people change and get better in balance and gait through exercise? And what you saw were many papers coming out using a lot of different exercises really focused on gait and balance, right? And they reported, there's so many papers out there that have clearly showed that exercise, even in Parkinson's, helps gait and balance. But what you're going to notice is that there are very common things, threads, through all these exercise practices. And you're going to notice they have a lot of resemblance to learning. And how did I get good in mathematics? Or how did I get good at engineering or law or anything else? And that is, the more you do things, the better you're going to get. The more specific the thing is that I'm studying, I'm going to get better. The more complex where I have to solve it, I'm going to get better, right? So it has all the natural aspects of what learning does, is really what all these exercises are about. There isn't one exercise that's going to be the exercise. So regardless of what people want to do to convince you with their program, the truth is it's any program that engages you in what? Practice of things that you need to get better in, like gait and balance. We are using the same parameters that we do to learn because you don't have a Martian brain, right? You have a human brain. And so these rules still apply, and that's what you see. When we talk about goal-directed movement, all we're talking about is movement with a purpose. So I'm going through a training where I have to think about what I'm doing and do it accurately. We don't drag people through treadmills practice. We don't drag people through dancing practice. You don't drag yourself through a tennis lesson. You listen and you fix what you need to fix, and you do it correctly over and over again. So we wrote a paper about this concept that came out now many years ago, trying to get at this very point. And you're going to notice in my talk, I'm going to try to bring out the major points because, as you can see, I don't like gimmicks. I don't like people trying to sell one thing. I want you to come out of here understanding the bigger picture of what is it that we're trying to do. And now you can kind of already get the idea that, yes, these are learning parameters. I can get better at things if I have training, if I can break it down with someone that can give me feedback, and if I can take the time to practice. And the great thing about it is all these different activities have that, don't they? Okay, if I like dancing as a component of it, then make it into dancing. But it can be anything that I enjoy to do. And that also becomes important because we've learned that people are going to do better if they're having fun. I mean, who's been to a class? Anybody can think about a class where they were miserable, right? I've had an organic chemistry class. I can assure you I learned nothing in that organic chemistry class. My teacher was horrible. So being able to enjoy the process actually ends up being pretty important. And being able to choose the process is also quite important. The fact that I have choice and I enjoy it is going to make that not only more enjoyable, but actually influences how well you learn. So you've seen these pictures before. This is actually my patient, and this work was done by one of our physical therapists. And this is just to show you a gentleman who's having some trouble with walking and balance to some degree. He's using his cane, and you can see that certain terrains even really influence his walking. He has a lot of trouble crossing certain thresholds, and changing terrain is a little bit even overwhelming for him. But what we notice is that after practice, right? So this is what we talked about, and this is no change in medication at all. This is just getting into an amplitude, gait, and balance practice. Now remember what I said. It could be anything that involves gait and balance practice, okay? So, as you and I know, if this were a med, I'd be rich, okay? But it's not a med. So as you can imagine, I'm not supported by pharma in any way, shape, or form because, well, they're afraid of us. That's the bottom line. We could probably take any one of them on, head on with some of the data they've got in any event. So one of the things that I studied that I'm only going to touch upon briefly because it's a work in progress, I also studied cognition. And some of the things that I'm interested in is looking at, do those same sort of rules apply for cognition? Is it about thinking? Should I be thinking more, engaging thinking processes more? So whatever I do with exercise, should I really be breaking it down, getting a lot of feedback? Is that going to make an effect? So that's one idea. Another one that's come out from the aging field, maybe for those who study or follow exercise, the aging field has always been about aerobic practice and get your heart rate up, right? So that's another exercise parameter. And then there's also work being done on just physical activity and resistance training. What I'm trying to tell you is there's different types of exercise that probably have different types of benefit. Clearly, what I first started with is the most important one for Parkinson's, because we need skills. Gait and balance is a skill. That's why I started out of the gate talking about that. The most important thing, gait and balance. But now, what about cognition? Is that still true? What is it about exercise type? What I'm doing, does that influence it? I'm telling you, there's different types of exercises that have been studied for that reason that have different types of effects. I'm going to give you one example out of the gate. I'm going to show you some work we're doing with aerobic cardiovascular fitness. The reason I chose that was because the aging field had shown some work that had helped thinking in aging. So the question is, does it do that in Parkinson's disease? So think about what I'm talking about there. If I'm talking about aerobic, I'm talking about getting your heart rate up, right? I'm getting my heart rate up, and I keep doing that through any type of exercise practice, right? Because the idea is I'm extracting by getting my heart rate up regularly, I get more efficient in oxygen utilization. Do you understand that idea now? Very different than the skill practice idea. This is just getting my heart rate up. So I can do that on anything, stationary bike, right? I can get on a treadmill, elliptical, anything that gets my heart rate up may be important here. So I decided to take that on and see if that was true in Parkinson's disease. And the way I did that is I took 48 individuals and I measured, they were exercising regularly, and some of that exercise was aerobic in nature. So I measured their oxygen extraction, the VO2 max, as a reflection of cardiovascular fitness. It's very traditional in the literature to say, you have higher cardiovascular fitness, you are more aerobically fit. So I looked at that and tried to figure out, how is that associated with how well people are performing in their thinking? That's the neuropsychological battery. It's a test that measures your thinking capability. And I asked, are they related or not? Now we have a couple of domains that we looked at. I'm showing you a number of different types of thinking processes that occur in Parkinson's, in normal brain. So executive function is what I told you was that prefrontal system. That's my planning, my processor, attention, memory and learning, also memory recall, and visual spatial. Take-home point is that I looked at a number of different parameters in Parkinson's disease to see, is it related to cardiovascular fitness? And this is our paper that just came out this year to show that. So this paper, the fancy word, all of that, cardiorespiratory fitness is that. And we looked at cognition. And what we saw was, I'm going to have you look down below. See the outcome? See those 5 different domains: executive function, memory, visual spatial. We saw a very strong association with that in cardiovascular fitness. Okay? Memory, yes, absolutely. People who are more aerobically fit had better memory, better executive function. So that's my processor, my ability to plan, and visual spatial. That is what we found. Now that's a cross-sectional study. Our work going on right now is longitudinal, which means that if you're aerobically fit, does that predict how you're going to do in 2 years? That work is still going on right now. But also what we found was, not only did we see this association with being more aerobically fit in cognitive domains, but we also saw that it was associated with larger areas of the brain. So I'm just showing you a cartoon of some very deep structures in the brain. One of them in green is the thalamus. The thalamus is like the air traffic controller of the brain. It connects up with everything. Remember, the brain is about connection. So that thalamus connects up with thinking parts of the brain, memory parts of the brain. We saw that area of the brain larger in people who were more aerobically fit. And just to show you another example, this was some work we did in a mouse. All I'm showing you here is a cross section. I'm showing you the thalamus, but I didn't outline it. I'm just showing you middle picture here in red. This was an animal, some work my colleague did, who put a rodent on the exercise wheel, brought up his aerobic fitness and looked at the thalamus and saw that it was lit up like a light bulb. So again, just to show what we found in humans with Parkinson's, we also see in animals. So there seems to be some effect of aerobic exercise on this particular structure called the thalamus that may play a role for cognition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop for a second and I'm going to repeat a couple major points. Parkinson's disease is not simply about cells. Now you know that. It's about circuits and connections. Circuits and connections drive movement, and they're also involved in thinking. The original work that was done in Parkinson's disease, many of the first studies that came out, looked at a very particular type of exercise. And those exercises were really focused on skill and practice, because we knew that out of the gate that is really probably the most important component of plasticity is practice and learning. And we do that whenever we get involved in any type of exercise that is really repeating that, where I'm getting feedback and I'm learning to do better. That's number one. Now I switched gears and I talked about cognition. And I said, the question is that still true for cognition? What type of exercise should I be thinking about when I think about cognitive circuits, which is different than walking circuits? And I said, there are different types of exercises. I certainly could look at skill as well. In fact, I'm going to show you some data about that right away. But I decided to look at the aerobic exercise first because the aging field had looked at that and had shown some nice data. That's why I started with that parameter. It's not to say those other parameters aren't important, but that's what I looked at first, okay? Now let's go into mechanism. So now we're going to try to break down, how do I study exercise and mechanisms? Well, remember to the left, I told you connections are important, right? Connections is what plasticity is all about. So I'm going to look at these connections that are called synapses. How are the connections changing? And then to the right, in orange, is brain health. And that is things that improve the environment, things that support connections to change. So think about that like fertilizer. The brain health component is what's coming into the brain that is supporting changes in the brain that have to do with blood flow. So for example, getting more blood flow, I would imagine that would be good. Trophic factors, which is a type of fertilizer, I would imagine that to be good. Fuel, I probably need fuel to make that happen. I need that to happen. So you can see how, at least for our work, we had to conceptualize how I'm going to study this in the animal. And we focused on these 2 points. Show me if there's connections being changed. I convinced you that that's what happened. So I'm going to look at the engine and connections. And over to the other side, I'm going to look at different types of fertilizers. Is there any hint that there's something coming in to help support this from the periphery, as an example? Okay, so this is my husband's sense of humor here. This is our little mouse who's HIPAA compliant. And this is him on the treadmill. And the point is, a lot of work that we do is very much interrelated with animal models. They become very important for us to understand, right, how these changes are happening in the human brain. And so what I'm showing you here is just some of the original work that we did was actually on a treadmill. I think if I were, had probably made this on some sort of betting site, I probably would have made a ton of money, but I didn't. In any event, so these are Parkinson's mice that are running on the treadmill. This is the original work that we published, back in 2004. And these are Parkinson's mice that we put on a treadmill, and we did this so that we could begin to understand what was happening to their brain. And notice, the other point I want to make is this. We waited, we can create a Parkinson's mouse, we waited for them to develop Parkinson's, and then we put them on a treadmill. This was the original work that showed that exercise affects Parkinson's, this work. So here was what we showed. First of all, I'm gonna just, pardon me for a second, here we go. So I'm gonna show you, here's some of the original behavioral data that we had. I'm showing you, these are both Parkinson's mice. One guy is a couch potato. You see the couch potato guy? He's like looking for food, heading off the treadmill. And there's your rock and roller athlete right there, right? So there's a mouse, both Parkinson's, both of them. But the animal that's been practicing, he's like rocking and rolling. And look at the other little guy, like forget it, right? So there's your idea of practice. Now, again, that seems so silly now because we know that. But that was the original work, guys, to prove this. Because the fact is, they're Parkinson's. And even though they're Parkinson's, they can get better, you see. So the question that came up, of course, was, is this related to dopamine or not? Is there changes in the brain in dopamine or not? Before I show you this graph in a second, hear me out. Some initial work in dogs looked at dopamine in the blood. But the problem with that is there are other sources of dopamine in the blood that are not brain derived at all, like the adrenal medulla. They have these cells that can release dopamine. So when that work was originally done back in the 60s, they were measuring that. They were not measuring brain levels of dopamine. So we took those mice and we took their brains out and we looked at dopamine levels. And I'm going to show you something so it's perfectly clear, like out of the gate. You will never forget this. Here, MPTP is a label for your Parkinson's mouse, right? And here's your exercise animal. I showed you how amazing that animal was, correct? And here's your no exercise animal, okay? Now I want you to look at those bars. You see those black bars? That's the dopamine level. Here's an exercise animal and there's a no exercise animal, okay? You got the point? There was no change. So anybody that stands up there and tells you dopamine changes the level of the brain, they're wrong. And they are misquoting our work. And I've seen that happen before, and we've corrected them. They're plain wrong. There is no change. Exercise affects on the brain aren't affecting the gas tank level of dopamine, period. However, and so if they cite it, they're misquoting our work. And also if they cite it, they're talking to you about another study that was done incorrectly. Yeah, I'm kind of not happy when people do that. So, however, let's go to the gas tank, guys, okay? We're back into that gas tank. Oh, sorry, the engine. We're back into the engine. So I told you at the gas tank level, there's no change in gas. So that's not causing this behavior. I didn't fill that gas tank up more. Exercise didn't do that. Let's go to the engine now, all right? So now I'm at the level of the engine, and I'm looking at how efficiently the gas is being delivered. How efficiently is the gas being delivered in the engine? So we did a technique, and the name of that technique has a fancy name. It's a dopamine release technique. I'm literally measuring how quickly that gas is being delivered, not the amount now, but how quickly it's being released into the gas tank. And what I'm showing you, big point, this is a paper in 2007, guys. I'm showing you, look down below. Here's the hatch, light gray hatch versus the dark gray hatch. The hatch is showing different parts of the basal ganglia, different parts of the circuit that we looked in. Literally, we looked across the engine to see how quickly the gas was being released across the engine. The hatch mark is the exercise animal, and the non-hatch mark is the non-exercise animal. What's the point? The point I'm showing you is the gas is being released better, faster in the engine, in the exercise animal. The higher bar is the measurement of showing how fast that dopamine is being released. The gas is being released faster and more efficiently than the non-exercise. So what am I trying to tell you? I am telling you, it's about dopamine release. It's about the efficiency of dopamine. If you exercise, your dopamine is working more efficiently. It does not change the level at all. It's changing the efficient release. We're talking at the engine, guys. That's where we're talking here. So it makes it more efficient. Does it matter? Hello? Yes, it does. Do I need to show you that picture of the animal again? Of course it does. So the idea is that there's a lot of things that happen when you exercise that people, you have to kind of look into the details of what's happening. We just happened, because we didn't see any dopamine levels, we wanted to see, well, maybe something was happening with gas release, and it was true. It's more efficient. Think about it as adding something to your engine to make your gas work better. That's what exercise is doing. It's actually making the gas release better for you. Okay. Now, we went back to that gas tank because, we had people, when we did the original work, who said, that's not possible. That's not possible. That's not. Okay. I mean, we just did the work, guys. So sure, we'll look at the gas tank again. And what we did is we counted cells. I'm going to show you this right below. Look at the graph down below where I'm showing you 4 bars, right? This is a paper again in 2007. So this is old work, but I just wanted to really hash this point out. Remember I told you there's no change in overall dopamine levels with exercise, and yet I get benefit? Those guys wanted us to count the number of cells as well. And you see in black in the hatched, those are dopamine cells, guys, right? They're both Parkinson's. I showed you how much better one animal was going. There was no difference in dopamine cells. It has nothing to do with the gas tank, guys. That's what I'm trying to tell you. What I'm going to show you is the engine in just a second, but there was no level of dopamine, change in dopamine levels, and there was no change in the number of cells. And yet, that animal got better, correct? So we have to try to explain that, right? And the first thing I already showed you is that dopamine is being released more efficiently. And does that matter? Are you kidding me? Of course it matters, right? We see an improvement in behavior. If I release dopamine more efficiently, it's going to matter. The other thing I'm going to show you here, and I apologize again, this is a paper that came out a year or so after that. We looked at dopamine receptors. So these are a lot of different techniques to look at dopamine receptors. So what are dopamine receptors? Dopamine receptors are the reciprocal. They're the reciprocal. They are where the dopamine works. Okay, they are throughout the engine, and they are where dopamine is going to land. Right. So think about where the gas is going to hit the circuit. So that's dopamine receptors, and we wanted to know if there were more of them. So think about it this way, guys. If I'm telling you gas is more efficient and there's more places that gas can work, do you think you'd be better? Yeah. Yes, you would, right? Of course you would, because gas is now working more completely through the circuit. And so what we found was one of those receptors, a very important one, D2 receptor, was upregulated. So I'm showing you panel B is an arrow showing a Parkinson's animal that's not exercising and a Parkinson's animal that was. So we saw that these receptors of dopamine had increased in the brain. That was just exercise, right? And we measured that in another way. We decided to take a picture of the amount of dopamine receptors in the brain just from exercise. So let me walk you through this study. This paper was published in 2010. We were fortunate enough at the time to have a chemist who could make something that would bind dopamine receptors and that was colored, that we could take a picture of, right? It's radio labeled, so we can take a picture of it in a special scanner. And what I'm showing you here in red is the basal ganglia of a healthy rodent. And when I make them Parkinsonian, we know there's dopamine less drops, but we also know the receptor drops out too. So that's why I'm not seeing red anymore. That's part of it. So we're not seeing any dopamine receptors, really so faint, right? And then this is exercise. So remember I told you that those receptors go up throughout the brain, and we knew that was we knew that this was happening in animals. We wanted to show it another way, and we were able to show that. Does that make sense? So dopamine receptors went up. And we thought, well, you know what? Why don't we use the same chemical in humans? Because it was safe. And we just said, yeah, let's do it, because we had animal data. So here I'm saying dopamine is working more efficiently and the dopamine receptors are going up. Is that true in humans? And that was a paper that came out about a year after that. And what I'm showing you in this red circle down below is that red. Remember the red that we saw here in the animals that was with exercise? Where there it is in the humans. This is a human after exercise where we saw, this is a basal ganglia. I'm just showing you in 3 dimensions, 3 different directions of the picture. One is we're looking down in the head. Here we're looking from the front towards the back of the brain. And here we're looking on the side. And this was the best. I like this picture the best. That's why I'm circling it. In red is where the exercise effect is. This is a person, we had basically about 8 people. We ran them on the treadmill for about 6 to 8 weeks, and we imaged them and we showed the same effect. Dopamine receptors go up in Parkinson's disease. Okay, I'm gonna move ahead. So remember, okay, this is good. So dopamine is changing in its efficiency in a big way. Not only is it more released more efficiently, but the receptors and where dopamine works is fine. But I promised you I was going to show you something about the actual connections themselves. And remember, so connections happen at the level of the synapse, which means that if we had to blow up that circuit, like really blow it up at a high mag, we would see something like this. We would see these actual connections happening between cells. And they actually have a lot of different interesting shapes, but they're connecting one cell to the other. Right here is what that connection would look like, but sometimes I can only see one part of the connection because I'm only filling, let's say I fill this with dye, I only see one side of the connection. So this is what I'm going to show you next. So let's look at brain connections and exercise. So the first thing we did, I'm just showing you 3 examples. These are cells that I cut from pictures and I put them together. So it's not one brain. I'm showing you examples of this, the basal ganglia. These are cells in the basal ganglia that have connections. Now we can measure connections because they have these long arborizations. That means like a tree. They have all these things sticking out in themselves to get connections ready. So we're going to look at that level. And then we're going to look at these tiny little synapses on their arms in a second. So let's take a look at the big picture first. Look at the cell. This is a healthy cell. So that means I'm giving you an example of a healthy animal. This is a cell in the basal ganglia. We filled it and we measured and we trace. So that's why you can see it. We wanted to show you how beautiful that looks. That's actually what a normal cell looks like. It has all these little limbs out to try to connect up with other cells that are maybe over here that are going to send connections over. This is what happens when you lose dopamine. Do you see the difference right away? When you have dopamine, you lose connections. Do you understand that? You don't see quite the arborization, right? You actually lose some connections. And this is exercise. That was that animal. All right. Now, this is just, again, a 3D image of that. We just took that picture and just showed you how we can measure it. So this is showing you in 3D. So these connections are happening in 3D is all I'm trying to show you. But more importantly, just to show you how robust exercise can improve connections. And then we decided to take a look. Remember I told you we can look at synapses. So I'm taking, remember that little cell? Here's the cell, go back. So I don't show you the center here, I just show you the little trees, limbs. Now I'm gonna show you the actual, here's a cell. Here are those little connections coming out. Remember I told you all the arborization. You see all those little buttons on them? Those are the synapses, guys. So we do that by, it's a technique where we fill a cell with a type of dye, and it fills the cell, and it actually lets us start seeing these little tiny synapses. They're like little thorns on a tree. Those are synapses, guys. Isn't that cool? That's actually where everything's happening, through those little connections. And what we decided to do is measure them. So that actually is a hell of a lot of work. That's a full thesis. That's about 4 years work of a grad student. And so he did that. Bill Toy in the lab did this work, and he showed that here's an animal with just Parkinson's, and he started measuring the amount of these little buttons, and sure enough, it went up with exercise. So what I'm trying to tell you is that, okay, what we're able to show so far with exercise is that we may not see more cells or more dopamine levels, but what we see is much more efficient use of dopamine. Certainly where dopamine works is much more upregulated, and we show that in humans. And at least in animals, we're able to show not only is a change in how dopamine is efficient, we're actually able to show that there's more connections in those areas of the brain. Okay, so let's go back for a second and let's talk about different exercise types a little bit. And remember, we've been talking about aerobic exercise and what it does for thinking, and skill-based exercise. There's different types of exercise that help us in different ways. I think that's the other thing to really kind of think about when you're doing your exercise, and just to stress this enough. You know, just saying that I exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes is not enough. You need to be thinking about what is it that I'm doing in my exercise to practice, right? And anyone that's like played an instrument, you know, you think like piano, like I'm going to work on my chords now, and I'm going to work on my, you know, whatever, my timing, my rhythm. I mean, like anything, exercise have different types of benefits. So when I'm doing a certain type of exercise, I'm thinking about how it's helping me, right? So one of my colleagues, Daniel Holschneider in the lab, decided to look at how does aerobic exercise compare to skill-based exercise for cognition. And we did this because, again, we were trying to tease out, does it matter what you do? And is there any absolute? So I just want to show you some work that was done by my colleague. But I think the first thing I want to do is just to remind you a little bit of what skill-based exercise is. Now, obviously, I'm not asking people, you know, to start doing, you know, whatever, soccer or anything else. But you guys, to just remind you, you do skill-based exercise when you do, you know, your gait and balance training. I mean, this is an extreme, but that's what skill is, you know, or tennis or Tai Chi. I'm learning to do something better. So one of my colleagues decided to kind of try to emulate that idea in our rodent model of Parkinson's. And he did that by using 2 types of wheels. One was a skilled wheel where you can see to the left, that's, you know, you're paying attention on that wheel. That little rodent, that Parkinson's rodent is going to pay attention on that wheel, all right? Otherwise, he's going to hurt himself. Keep in mind that these wheels are motorized, so they're moving. They are moving. These guys have to figure it out fast. They don't have a choice. This is not under their control. We're actually driving the speed of this. So they have to figure it out and keep moving. And then we'll get the speeds up faster and faster if they do fine. And then on to the right is the aerobic exercise. And you can see in this scenario, they're not having to think very much because it's smooth, right? So that's a whole different experience right there. Okay, so in this work, what happened was my colleague, after the animals, both Parkinsonian, went through that training for about 8 to 10 weeks. He then put in this dye called C14 iodo-antipyrine. That's what you see. So there's an animal, he's finished, that's that little white triangle. He's Parkinson's, he's finished his little training. He either did the skilled wheel or the non-skilled wheel. And we put a little catheter in and deliver this dye. And then what happens next is a little brain comes out, right? And then we have to slice up his brain. And then we put it on film to the right. And then we colorize to see where the blood is going. That also takes a lot of work. So that's another thesis. Every single project I'm showing you right here took a hell of a lot of work, a hell of a lot of time to do, as you guys probably appreciate. So this is the work that Dr. Hallschneider published. And it was very interesting work because what he was going to show here, and I'm going to go through, is the differences in blood flow using that skilled exercise paradigm versus the non-skilled exercise paradigm. And what I'm showing you in the first slide, see the two at the very top, what we're highlighting here is a prefrontal cortex. So this is the executive system, prefrontal cortex, executive system. Red, yellow is huge blood flow there. So the reason that's interesting is because you can see, even with skilled exercise, I'm getting blood flow there, aren't I? With aerobic, I showed you that. See, we're getting blood flow there as well. That's aerobic practice, just pure aerobic practice. But look what happens when I do skilled. So the reason I'm saying that is it's just trying to explain that, you know, different types of exercise have some overlap in gain, but perhaps the idea that certain types of exercise may enhance that even more. It's not to say that aerobic exercise isn't important. I showed you some of the initial work we have. It is. But skilled exercise, the point is what I'm doing when I do gait and balance training, I'm probably tapping into some aspects of thinking as well that are beneficial. So that's kind of good to know that it's not just about aerobic practice. I'm not just improving thinking only when I'm getting on my bike and working out on my bike to get my heart rate up, but I'm probably also doing that when I'm doing types of skill. Okay, I realize I'm short in time. So I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and end there for right now. I'm sure there's lots of questions just with that, so I'll stop. And before I do that, pardon me for a second, because I just want to introduce really quickly. So this is my group. And you can see it's been a lot of people over the years. Our whole lab is dedicated to Parkinson's. We do human and animal studies. We've had a number of grad students and a lot of undergrads that have helped us to try to understand why does exercise help people with Parkinson's disease, but not just behavior-wise, but mechanism. And of course, the point is, why do we want to know mechanism? Because we want to identify other targets, right? We want to find other ways to help repair. And the more we can understand what's driving it, the more we can begin to introduce other perhaps treatment strategies. And if anybody asks if I can create an exercise pill, I'm going to say, are you kidding me? No. All right. I am not God. I will never, and no one will ever be able to do that, because the point is there's a lot of different mechanisms involved. There will never be an exercise pill. And the point is, why would you want it anyway? Right. So we can maybe find drugs that enhance this effect, but no one is here to create an exercise pill.